G'day, and welcome to the Seacreatures Podcast, a show all about the amazing animals that live beneath the waves. Each episode, we chat about a specific sea creature with a guest who has spent time and interacted with this ocean animal. Our guests range from marine biologists to underwater photographers, citizen scientists, scuba divers, and anyone with an intense passion for marine life. My name's Matt Testoni, and I'm all of the above. And joining me for this episode of the Seacreatures Podcast is Nerida Wilson, and she's a marine molecular ecologist, Seadragon aficionado, and co-founder of Seadragon Search. I'm going to be talking all about the Ruby Seadragon today. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
No worries. So, before we dive into the world of sea dragons a bit more, how did you get into sea dragons, or what sparked your kind of intense passion for them?
It is such a great question because I did not start my diving career with an intense passion for sea dragons. I was all about nudibranchs, and that was sort of the basis of most of my research career. And so I would push sea dragons out of the way when I was diving. Not literally, but just noted, but not whatever. And I would be just completely focused on fighting nudibranchs. So yeah, it wasn't until a bit later, I think, probably a bit when I was in the US doing postdocs, that I kind of just got this fresh appreciation for Australia and its wonderful wildlife, both on land and underwater. So I think coming back to Australia, I was sort of thinking about doing some research on sea dragons before I left, but then the time away and kind of intensified my desire to do that and to understand more. So yeah, it was like a late in life passion.
Yeah, absence makes the heart grow fonder in the world of sea dragons. So before we dive into the Ruby, tell us what a sea dragon is.
So a sea dragon is a fish, and that is lost on people sometimes because they're such unusual looking fish, and people just think of seahorses sitting upright, and sea dragons are of course more forward moving like a normal fish, but they don't look like a normal fish, and they have these beautiful leafy appendages that they use to sort of camouflage themselves. So yeah, they're kind of weird fish.
Yeah, and so you kind of said then that they swim along, so they swim horizontally rather than vertically. And what other differences are there between a seahorse? Because that's one of the things people often get confused. Sea dragon, seahorse, what is it?
Yeah, so close but so different. They are in the same family, so they are evolutionarily, quite reasonably closely related. But seahorses, of course, are known for having this amazing male pregnancy pouch. And so the male will raise these little babies in a pouch, and then when they hatch, it's a very beautiful, cool little cloud of babies coming out. So sea dragons have a similar situation where the male holds the eggs and broods them on a tail patch, not pouch. So they're sort of exposed to the environment. So that's a real sort of biological difference between the two.
Yeah, and so if anyone hasn't seen a sea dragon before, they're about 30 centimeters in size, covered in these appendages, and they have these eggs on their tail. Now, before we talk about Ruby, I have to ask this from a researcher, but often the leafy sea dragon has kind of these yellowish eggs, I believe, that blend in, but the weedy has bright purple eggs.
Yeah, the leafy eggs actually are a bit more like salmon pink, I would say, whereas the weedy or the common sea dragon, they are sort of a more bright red and then go a bit like dark maroon as the embryos grow bigger.
Why are they different? Why is it such a bright color? Because it's pretty iconic when you're looking at a weedy sea dragon.
Yeah, I'm not sure. The yolk, is it the color it is? No, I'm not sure. It could be, weedy sea dragons do have some coloration that may be derived from the diet, and we know that lots of red pigments sort of come from crustaceans that they eat. So it could just be that that's a readily available source. I'm really not sure.
Mystery of the ocean. Anyway, that was that was really off topic. But basically we just mentioned there that we've got a leafy sea dragon, and they're more on the west coast of Australia, and a weedy sea dragon or common sea dragon, which is found kind of all around. So now we're going to delve into what's the third type of sea dragon?
Dun, dun, dun. Speaking of red, so the third species, which is, a lot more recently known, is what we've called the Ruby Seadragon. And that is the sister species to the weedy or common sea dragon.
When was the ruby first identified as a different species? Or when did we find out that we had 3 species of sea dragon in the world?
Yeah, so often when a new species is discovered and the time period between its discovery and the description can be really quite long, like 20 years sometimes or more. With the Ruby Seadragon, I think we, let's say, discovered it in 2013 and we described it in 2015. So it's actually pretty quick because we were pretty excited.
How was it found that there was this species? Like, was it washed up on the beach? Or tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I think like a lot of species that haven't been described yet, they are, known's probably a strong word, but like there's evidence of them if you look. So there might be specimens in a museum collection that hasn't been recognised yet, or people have noticed something but never realised. I think the ruby stayed out of sight because it tends to be in waters that are deeper than divers tend to go. So I think that kind of kept it out of the limelight for way too long.
Yeah, and I guess also not just deeper, but it's in areas where divers probably aren't diving as much. So like, where is the Ruby Seadragon found usually?
Yeah, so we're actually still working on figuring out its distribution, in a much more robust way. So we really, when we published the description, I think we had 4 specimens or something, which is not that many. So one had been trawled off southern Western Australia. 2 others were in a collection that had been trawled, well, the label said, I think it was like off Garden Island, which is near Perth. But those kinds of descriptions off can mean like many kilometres away or close, but the depth indicated that it was probably a bit further away. And there was one specimen that had washed up on Cottesloe Beach in 1919. So it had been sitting in a collection for a really long time waiting for its little day.
Wow. So it's kind of in that southwest corner of Australia. And we're talking about pretty deep. So generally what happens, I guess, is you've got the shallower area where seaweeds are, and that's where the Weedy Seadragon and the Leafy Seadragon kind of often inhabit. But there's another zone kind of just below that. It's not really deep. Is that the Ruby Seadragon's kind of niche habitat? And what's that habitat that it's living in like?
Yeah, such good questions, Matt. I wish I had answers for all of them. Look, we certainly know that, they do tend to be found in those deeper waters. So I think sort of 50 metres plus are the records that we have currently. And that, as you say, that bit of habitat is almost like a little bit missed. So it's deeper than divers tend to go, apart from some technical divers and commercial divers. And the habitat where we recorded the ruby living was kind of I would describe it as like a low relief sponge, little bit of algae kind of habitat, but it was like a little island in sand. So it was quite heavily sanded, and that, it was kind of a discrete patch. And I presume that in that area there are sort of lots of interconnected patches, but a lot of sand around as well. But there's not that sort of large rocky habitat, or like we know for shallow sea dragons, they tend to sort of visually orient around like a big rock formation or a pier or a jetty. There just didn't seem to be anything like that. So it's a very exposed place to be living or diving, to be honest. So it would feel pretty weird to be there.
Yeah, and just to like kind of give us a image of what it's like. So there's not seaweed. What is there on these like little bits of reef? What's living there?
So there is a little bit of algae, actually. I remember seeing some Caulerpa. I'm not sure what species off the top of my head, but so the water can be quite clear there. So it's still, really in that sort of photic zone. But yeah, there were a bunch of different kinds of sponges. I think there were some bryozoans. Yeah, there were some sort of the ones that have the sort of 3-dimensional habitat. Yeah, it was like a mix. And I presume there was some hard substrate underneath that sand where those things were attaching to. So probably some sort of limestone bed, I think, under the sand. But yeah, it was diverse and interesting. Like, it's a cool place. Yeah, made all the better by the presence of the ruby.
Yeah, cool. So you've kind of mentioned that's where we found it. Or tell us about what is we found it, or was it an expedition, or you had a hint, or talk us through how that came about, or what that process was.
Sure. Yeah. So obviously the first steps were understanding that it existed, and that came through a PhD student who, at the time, Josephine Stiller, and she was working on the genetics of the two common shallow water species, so the Weedy and the Leafy, and she had gotten this sample from a specimen that was in the Western Australian Museum collection. And so it was actually through DNA sequencing data that we first got our first glimpse, I guess, of Ruby. I saw it as a string of ACTGs, right? It's kind of a crazy way to recognize a new species for the first time. And so, yeah, and then, of course, we went back to the morphology of that specimen and were able to look at all those differences. But then, of course, we had knowledge then of where that specimen had been collected, and we were like, we have to go back and take a look. Like, what? Like, we need to try and see this animal. So we put together a small expedition and took an ROV and went and looked at that spot. Or it took a number of days, which I can go into at length, but essentially on the very last day, the very last chance, because there'd been these big swells pounding through, which is a very exposed location. And on, the very last day, we sort of popped the ROV down, and I think the dives could last for about 20 minutes with the batteries that we had. And so we did one dive and didn't see anything, brought it back up, changed it over, popped it back down again, and then immediately there was like a little malfunction. And so the ROV just settled into this pile of gravel. And one of my other passions is to look at tiny animals that live in gravel and sand. So I was like eyeing off this beautiful aerated gravel, thinking, oh gosh, I wish I could just get a sample of that. So I got a very close up look at that for like 10 minutes. And then the pilot was able to, fix the problem and pop the ROV up off the bottom again and start moving along. And we saw one like pretty quickly after that. So it was so exciting. It's like finding the sort of ruby needle in the haystack, like the idea of going to a place in this remote ocean thinking they're around here somewhere, right? And then finding one, like it was madness. And it totally paid off, and we were extremely happy at that time.
Wow, that's so cool. I can't believe you found it, because it literally is a needle in a haystack, like searching for an animal in an area you got, historically was, and wow, it's like a scientific victory.
Yeah, there was a great deal of joy. And that first animal that we saw, we sort of followed for a little while, and it led us to a second animal. And so that was just, it's just crazy.
Wow. So a lot of people, if they haven't seen sea dragons before, Weedy Seadragons are the common one you'll see if you Google Seadragon, and they've kind of got these like leaf-like appendages, and they're very pretty with lots of speckles. And the leafy is really blended in and has all these really big and intricate kind of appendages. What is a Ruby Seadragon like?
Well, the funny thing is that when we first saw a photograph of that first sequence specimen, I don't know, until that point, it's like I knew it was something different, but it's like it's hard to believe looking from sequence data, right? We're humans. We want to see the differences. We want to see a thing. And that's not always the case. There are plenty of animals that are only differentiated, not morphologically, like not by the shape and the color and things like that, but just genetically. But in this case, when we first saw the photograph, it was like, honestly, kind of a mix between the two. It had the sort of longitudinal lines on the body like a leafy sea dragon does, and no spots at all like the Weedy Seadragon normally does. And so it just had this beautiful mix of characters between the two, but it also did not have any leafy appendages, which was quite interesting. It had the little sort of skeletal projections that would normally indicate where they would be, but there weren't any sort of pieces on them.
Wow, and that would be because of their habitat, I'm guessing?
Well, we're still guessing too, yeah. I think, it makes sense if there's much less algae and it's a much more exposed and sort of sponge-like environment that probably the need for that type of camouflage has passed. Probably just an ancestor, those little stumps are there sort of because of the evolutionary history. But we don't know. We don't know for sure, and there's still lots to learn because the way that those samples have been collected, it's possible that the appendages came off if they're just very fragile. So, yeah, still some questions.
And do they eat the same things as Weedy and Leafy Seadragon, like tiny little shrimp, or we don't know?
Yeah. Honestly, there's not that much study about the diet of the common shallow ones either, and that's because it's not sort of ethically acceptable to go and catch a bunch and cut open their stomach contents, which is how we, learn about that stuff. So, but we do know that they eat sort of small crustaceans. And yes, in the first dives that we saw with the rubies, they were feeding in really similar ways to their shallow counterparts, although they did seem to sort of tended to like move up in the water column to make strikes. So potentially they were silhouetting the prey against the surface maybe. Maybe that was a more efficient way of seeing them. But, that's just based on some very small observations. But yeah, same kind of strike motion.
Yeah, cool. And I've read, and like, again, there's so much unknown stuff, but I've read that their tails are actually super different. Please correct me or talk us through the different tails.
Yeah, look, that was one of the cool things that we discovered from doing the live expedition, because the sample that was from the Western Australian Museum actually had its tail tip cut off for the genetic sample. So we didn't realise quite how fateful that would be. So all of the scans and the images we have of the holotype are missing the tip of its tail. So when we went and actually saw them alive in their habitat, immediately we could see it curled up in a little coil like, more like a seahorse. And we didn't see them actually like holding on to things, but they certainly would drape it across things that they were going past, and those things would like recoil a little bit like they were sort of grabbing onto them. And certainly from seeing the swell, like the day before, we tried to put the ROV down and just could not hold on the bottom. And this is at 50 meters, right? and the surface didn't seem that bad, but, the strength of the swells down there are amazing. So it makes sense that if you don't want to move off your little patch of habitat, you don't want to be swept into some sandy desert, you might, it might be beneficial to evolve a mechanism for hanging on more maybe.
Yeah, wow. So just like a seahorse, they probably use their tails to hold on. I mean, that's pretty crazy. What do you think came first? Like, do you think the ruby evolved into a weedy sea dragon and lost its tail ability, or it re-got it?
Well, we know from genetic work that the ruby sea dragon is the closest relative to the common sea dragon. So those are what we call sister species. And then, of course, the leafy sea dragon is sister to those. So from that, we can say that the not having a tail that hangs on is the ancestral condition for those guys, but also that having appendages is the ancestral condition for those as well. So there's two kinds of morphological changes we can track just by understanding the way they're related.
Cool. So, sorry, I have to ask, was that a yes? The ruby sea dragon is the first one, or is this a... We don't know.
There's no first, right? You have an ancestral organism that then... goes down two different evolutionary pathways. And so there's not a first there. You think of it as a mirror image almost. So we would say that the divergence date between common sea dragon and the ruby sea dragon, we've been able to date that to about 3.72 million years ago. So that's the point in time, give or take, where they became different things.
Wow. So, and excuse my genetic ignorance, but... does that mean sea dragons are 3 million years old?
Well, older, because the divergence of the leafy and those other guys is even earlier.
Wow.
Yeah. So they've been around. They've seen some things. They've seen some sea level go up and down, right?
Yeah. And so this is a question that I always think to myself when I read about the ruby sea dragon's crazy tail. If it's like latching onto stuff, does it still, or would it probably still have the eggs laid on its tail like a normal sea dragon would?
And I can answer that convincingly because, like, good for science and bad for the individual, the specimen that was in the Western Australian Museum actually was a pregnant male. And so we could see that they attach exactly in the same way as its closest relative, the common or weedy sea dragon.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, we were kind of lucky, and that individual was unlucky, but we were lucky to learn so much about the species from a single individual.
Yeah, and so a really rough estimate, or in your opinion, what is like the conservation status or the population of ruby sea dragon? Do you think it's healthy? Do you think it's not? Like, I know it's a pretty crazy question, but...
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, like all cygnathrids, they are protected. The habitat where they're found, like, we're still trying to use methods to understand that better. But there's certainly, commercial fishing activity and things like that happens in that area. And from looking at the habitat, it does look like kind of fragile. Like I can imagine if you ran a trawl over that, you would probably, dispense with it pretty quickly. And we just don't know at that sort of finer scale mapping, like how many patches are available or like how close. And like sea dragons, you might have a ton of, speaking of the shallow ones now, you might have a ton of seagrass meadows and colonia beds, but you don't find sea dragons everywhere. They have this weird way of only being in this patch and not that patch. And if we can't understand if that's a habitat quality thing or if it's just a personal preference thing, or we don't know why they're not found everywhere that what we think is suitable habitat is. So you can map, how many patches of this deep habitat occurs, but it doesn't mean that it's suitable for rubies all the time. We just don't know. There's so much we don't know about that species. It is quite annoying. So much to do.
A great ocean mystery. I love it. So, we've talked about like how, so with sea dragons, like you talked about a pregnant male and they carry the eggs. And then earlier you spoke about how you were looking at one ruby sea dragon and then it went to another. Do we know how sea dragons find each other underwater, especially if they're only found on specific patches? Do we know at all?
I have no idea. I mean, I think they're really interesting because they're kind of, like, I wouldn't call them solitary animals, but you don't often find them all together unless perhaps you're at a habitat that engenders that, like around a pier. But typically out in a patch of a colonia, you know that that's the right habitat and you know that there's, you've seen them there before and you go back and they're there again, but they don't tend to hang out exactly with each other. And so, but they're not ever just totally alone. So I just find it really fascinating about their sort of social system as well. We don't really understand too much about that. I think, they probably have a very good idea of who their neighbours are, but how they choose that mate, I have no idea.
Yeah, because I always just think of it from a silly scuba diver perspective where I'm down there, I can't even find my friend underwater who's like breathing all these bubbles. Like I can't imagine how a little sea dragon finds another little sea dragon. But that kind of leads me on to the next question. Like, so with like they find each other, we don't know much about how social they are or all that kind of world, but we're kind of finding out a bit more, aren't we? And that's through like citizen science, and that's through your project, the Seadragon Search project. So you want to tell us quickly what the Seadragon Search project is, and then a little bit how it works, and if there's been any rubies recorded in it.
The only rubies, I'm just going to say, that are in Seadragon Search are the ones I've put in there. Yeah, I'll fall off my chair the day one of those come in. That'll be cool. I'm looking forward to that day. But getting back to Seadragon Search, so it's a citizen science, or we say community science project, where we ask divers that have images of sea dragons if they wouldn't mind sharing those with us and uploading them to a data portal. And then with those images, we apply some machine learning tools and we use the unique patterns on the faces as a kind of facial recognition, I suppose, for sea dragons. And we can match images of the same dragon taken by different people at different points in time. And so we can say, okay, that's dragon number blah, 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 and that's dragon blah, blah, blah. And so we build up a timeline using images of a dragon's life. And not just one dragon, but thousands of dragons. And so through people's contributions, like, it might just be one or two photos or it might be a ton of photos, we're gradually building up this picture of sea dragons' lives. And so that's enabling us then to answer questions like how many there are and how often they reproduce and all these kinds of questions that have been like buzzing around forever. We're able to actually start putting some numbers on some of those things. So it's really exciting. And I love the community spirit that it's brought out amongst people. So it's a really, satisfying project to be involved with.
Yeah, and what's some of the craziest or the coolest findings from Seadragon Search? I usually ask people for a cool fact or something, but tell us some like cool findings.
Yeah, the thing is I find it all so exciting that it's usually like the most recent thing that's happened that I'm like super pumped about. But I do have this special place in my heart for these records where a dragon has been seen in a place and then it just goes away for like 5 years and then gets seen again. And I'm like, what has it been doing that whole time? Like, where has it been? Has it just been that people weren't diving in that same area as much? But there are some places that are like heavily dived by people, really discreet areas that get searched, and dragons will just disappear for years and come back. And I just love that. I don't know. It actually gives me more questions than answers, but I love it so much. It just, gets the imagination firing about the kinds of things that they're doing and some complexity in the lives that they live. Like, I think we tend to think, oh, well, they just sit here and people photograph them and they, live their life and die, but that's not what's happening. And so being able to tease out some of those more complex things, I just find really fascinating. So, and I just, I will also say that I'm a participant in my own project. So I do spend a reasonable amount of time photographing dragons in my own little backyard area, and I get wildly excited about seeing them, even though I see them all the time. So I'm not immune to the attraction of sea dragons.
You have to give us a hypothesis on where they go, or at least some kind of, you must have some like little theory.
Maybe. Look, I think in some areas, like let's use an example as, say, Flinders Pier, because it's a really famous place where people go and see dragons, and it's a very discreet man-made structure, and you swim around it, and it's sort of like a little path that you go. And divers will swim that path and photograph all the dragons in that. But what if, really the dragons are living in a much bigger area? Maybe I've envisioned kind of like a conveyor belt, like maybe a circle, and they're just going around that circle. Maybe it takes a year, maybe it takes a month, maybe it takes a week, and how long they spend at any part of that time, And so maybe it's just chance and time that they happen to be on the part of the circle that overlaps with the pier at the same time that a person has a camera and is thinking, I'm going to photograph that sea dragon and I'm going to upload it to Seadragon Search, So they might be seen other times. We don't record them. So we can't say that, the sightings in Seadragon Search reflect a total dragon's life. Of course, it's the part that's recorded. But I do imagine this amazing conveyor belt that we sometimes snap them in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, and what's like the furthest a dragon has traveled on this like conveyor belt per se?
Because it's very difficult to record fine scale positioning underwater. So we don't really ask people to say, were you 50 meters north or west of this thing or whatever. So, we have quite more generalized dive site names, so we can't pick up that kind of resolution of fine scale movement. The only thing we would pick up if they moved from one sort of formalized dive site to another. And that has happened, but it is, rather unusual.
Yeah. So we don't have any of that data yet, or like thinking about males more stationary in the one spot and females go around, or?
Yeah, that's really hard. I don't think we'll be able to answer those questions specifically with the data that we're getting from Seadragon Search. But I often wonder, we might be able to get at some of that by the discoverability of some animals. Like, is it in the months where the males are brooding that they're found more frequently? Because there is this idea that they come into the shallows and perhaps that's where they want to have their little babies hatch out. And so, if that brings them into a place where divers are more, you would expect to find them more frequently at that time of year, have them showing up. So there's ways we can get at that a little bit and perhaps build better hypotheses to go out and test in different ways. But yeah, it's such a great foundation, and you don't really know in which direction you're going to go or what thing you'll find. And yeah, so there's lots of potential.
So another like random question. I love like when someone who's like a real big expert in something comes on and I ask them all these ridiculous questions. But I've personally seen a whole bunch of like male sea dragons with eggs kind of come together. And then I've even read it, I think one line in a scientific paper mentioned it. But tell us why they would do that, or is that behavior we know about, or what's the go?
Yeah, it's a great question, because it's like one of those things that are known but aren't documented very well or barely at all. And so, you see really commonly in those months where males are brooding that they'll just be hanging out together. And I love that phrase, daddy daycare. And they seem like friends hanging out, they're really much closer than any other time of the year. And you wouldn't normally say that sea dragons have friends, right? So they do seem to spend long periods of time together. The purpose of it, I think, is still a bit unclear. I think there's probably multiple benefits, right? So they're probably picking an area that's maybe a good habitat, like in terms of surge and protection. So it might be a more sheltered space. Perhaps it's a little warmer. I'm not sure. It might be somewhere where they can feed without moving around too much. So it might be like a great feeding ground or something. It could be that there's protection in numbers. So we do see some broods that have been, I would say, predated upon, or we see broods that are no longer complete. And there are reports coming in of divers that see fish kind of grabbing at the broods. And clearly, like, it's a great yolky source. It'd be full of nutrients. And so perhaps as a group, they can minimize those interactions. So I think there's a bunch of different reasons why they could do it, but clearly there's a benefit because they do it. They definitely do it.
Yeah, and have you seen that behaviour? Has it been documented much on Seadragon Search, the citizen science project, or...?
It's yes and no. Like, it's quite hard to document social interactions through static images. And so we're just really careful to make sure that the scientific questions that we ask through the data that comes in through Seadragon Search is really robust. And so things like social interactions are probably a bit beyond that. But you can certainly capture, you know, if this brooding male and this brooding male and this brooding male are all found within 3 minutes, you know, like they're probably in a cluster together. So there are ways of drawing out some of that information. So yeah, and sometimes people have pictures of them all together, but it's rare to have the spot patterns of the face fully in focus for all 3 animals or whatever, you know, in one go. So yeah, it's tricky, it can be tricky.
One other question I have to ask with a little bit of Seadragon Search and a little bit of your genetics is sea dragons on the west coast and the east coast, still the same species or different species, or because they're a little bit different, aren't they?
They are, yeah. So, and the answer is they are, is to both of your questions. So they are the same species and they are a little bit different morphologically, yeah. So from the genetic work that we've done, we can establish that they are heavily structured. So you don't get a lot of immigration of animals from one area to another. And so that is reflected in their genetic sort of signature that you can kind of derive. But we can see that it's like a series that goes around Australia. And so things like the land that gets exposed between Tasmania and the mainland when the sea level is down does create a genetic break that is visible in the data. But there's also evidence of secondary contact after that break goes away again. So they're not different species in the sense that they can't interbreed and things like that. So you might consider them to be different units for conservation management purposes, but they are still considered the same species, if that makes sense.
Well, just before we kind of wrap up, if people want to get involved in Seadragon Search and they want to start taking photos and uploading photos, and they just want to see sea dragons, like, what advice have you got and how should they go about it?
So we have information about the project on a website called seadragonsearch.org, and there's information just generally about sea dragons as well as the project, and things like a code of conduct, so some suggestions about how you might want to interact with dragons. And there is this always a trade-off of, like, you know, getting appropriate photographs that capture data and not stressing an animal. And so we're really conscious of, you know, encouraging people to be really aware of their behaviours as well. Yeah, so we have the website. If you have a photo to upload, there's buttons that sort of say participate or submit a photo, and that will take you to a data portal. And there you can just sort of drag and drop your photo in and the associated
Was that drag and drop your photo in?
Oh, that's good, Matt. That's good. Yeah, do a drag and drop. I love it. And then, you know, add things like the date and location of where you saw it, and then we can use that. But we also have a Facebook page we encourage people to join, where there's amazing conversations going on between people and us, and trying to feedback some of the things that we're finding, or just, yeah, it's just a good time. So for people that don't dive but love sea dragons, they can really get involved in the project and what we're finding as well there. So there's sort of something for everyone in all these different formats.
Awesome. Well, that kind of brings us to the end of the show. Thank you so much for being on.
Thank you so much for having me. Love to talk about dragons.
Seacreatures Podcast is hosted, edited, and produced by myself, Matt Testoni. If you like the show, jump onto our Buy Me a Coffee page, where you can help with a little donation, which helps with our running costs. It's buymeacoffee.com/Matt Testoni. Production assistance by George McGrath, and music by the awesome, talented, and fantastic Dan Musil. I'd also like to thank all of our current and former Patreon members for helping out with the show. Seacreatures also has an Instagram, which is Seacreatures_podcast. Check it out for updates and what's coming up next on the Seacreatures Podcast. Speaking of up next, the next episode of the Seacreatures Podcast is going to feature one of my favorite guests from a previous episode, Ben Francischelli, and he's going to be talking all about the huge carnivorous whale, Leviathan. It's actually extinct, so don't worry too much. But that's up next. This has been the Seacreatures Podcast. Over and out.